Why, hello. It's nice to see you there. 541 Solstice 25, Winter Solstice 8. And just so you're aware, this video is a little bit on the pulling together what evidence we've seen so far to the topic, to what evidence we can make out of the environments that are brought into attention, as well as drawing a series of speculations and speculations of others I've come across that strikes my fancy and I think is very much worth the topic. But without further ado, let's get into this. As for why we are talking about this, Dark Souls 3, or Dark Souls as a series in general, has always been filled with very interesting details, and only on very particularly rare occasions do we ever find circumstances that should actually explain as to why they are as they are. But I'm otherwise convinced with enough determined effort, we can uncover a lot of things actually quite well. One of such big details would be, not only was this place only safeguarding some curse stones, or purging stones I should say, which were used to cure curse and hollowing, and things of Londor, but we also come across here an interesting sort of weapon which depicts exactly how supposedly the Profane Flame came to exist, but also leaves a lot of gaps to be filled. But in general, I've come to really want to do this as a thing because the most oddball depictions of things can come from a little of anywhere, and evidently they must certainly have meant something, right? And even if they don't make much sense at first glance, you can still pretty much paint some amount of a story together with them. But all in all, these kind of odd details that get placed about are some of the ones that people come to remember quite often, but they often never really come up with a particular reason as to why they stand out, nor come up with an explanation as to what is the real story going on here. But I would like to put a bit more story together for at least some of this. Doesn't really look like it now. Damn. A certain, maybe some kind of architecture must have inspired it.
You happen upon this coal. This is much too dark. Coal. This is much too dark. I see the abyss in it. Yet a smith I remain. I won't turn down a request. But forget not, your fight is for the flame and for your fellow kin, just like mine. A cursed fate this may be, but hope remains, does it not?
The Profane Capital, a place that was once prominent and a holier land, sworn and dedicated to much, to protections of the people and protection provided by a certain giant, who at one point even sacrificed it all to become a Lord of Cinder. But the profane capital itself was consumed by darkness. A darkness that was of the abyss. But how did it travel is the interesting thing. What is the case, though, is that this abyss wasn't just simply passed on as a very apparent dark entity, as it usually would be, but instead, it would be none other than the Profane Flame. This Profane Flame is profane for a reason. It is profane because it is everlasting. It is profane because instead of being brought a normal means of simply burning and continuing on in the same regular natures of a typical fire, instead it is enabled and continued by sorcery. And that is why it is everlasting. It practically has a sort of nature of its own, that gazing upon it, one can see the abyss, and in turn, many would be twisted and turned by it. Made more beast-like, more aggressive, more twisted. The many ways it affected people is quite plentiful, but how can we tell if they are someone actually affected by the abyss of the Profane Flame? One of the more obvious answers is obviously we can look through the items of those who apparently inhabit this general region, as the handmaidens have this dagger here, suggesting that they now take pleasure in wounding others. And that is part of what was the twisting of them as a result. But not just them. We also have the jailers here. If I can be not obliviously blind. Branding iron of the jailers prowling Irithyll dungeon, pressing at searing foes to inflict fire damage and temporary black Estus healing. So we know this belongs to the jailers. I thought that probably would have said more, but oh well. Their actual set actually distinguishes more, actually. But first let's, while we're still under the weapons, the Profane Flame, which never goes out, imbues this weapon with a fire damage. This is wielded by gargoyles of the Profane Capital. Okay. Also wielded by the gargoyles of the Profane Capital. Never goes out, imbues with fire damage. Okay. That's interesting and all. How do we know that they're actually at all being twisted or anything? Originally ritualistic formal wear, the jailers were among the few survivors inhabiting the Profane Capital, later serving under Pontiff Sullivan. Perhaps the screams emanating from the cells helped them forget their old home. Now, this could imply that they were actually more protected from the flame, but at the same time, it's like they emit a darker nature at the same time. That is the more peculiar detail. But in this regard, it's more so implied that they were just sort of mischievous of individuals who survived the Profane Capital. But by survive, I think it perhaps implies what happened to the rest of the Profane Capital, as much of it was destroyed, and if you just go simply further inside of it, there are charred bodies all over, as when Yorm himself linked the fire rained from the sky and incinerated all in a proximity, as the fire itself was originally intended to incinerate human flesh. Which would imply our dear friend here, the laddersmith Gilligan, survived such a cruel fate. But as for what really got him, we don't have any real way to know that. But we know he had some deeds with the mischievous in the past, in which case maybe that finally caught up to him. Or perhaps in the real final crumbling times, those of the gargoyles, and that's perhaps finally got up to him also, as more and more things became treacherous and it was no longer a safe environment, and perhaps those who also crept up along it from Irithyll also probably condemned it to mostly remain within itself, if I were to guess. Whichever case, we really can't know that, and we have no very obvious ways to determine that, aside from this horrific amount of nearby wreckage. But despite the amount of wreckage, we know for a fact he survived long enough to emplace these ladders here. One here, one that leads to down there, one over there, and one that takes us up here. A very interesting amount of ladders. And it's also in his own unique style of ladders as well. Just at the bottom of this floor is also littered with remnants of what were his ladders, but ruined. Perhaps these were ones that were supposed to be, but just somehow just didn't take off for whichever reason. Or more than likely, there was more to this place being traversed with ladders, and it probably got just all around wrecked and destroyed, more than likely, as far as I'm concerned. That would have more than likely have been the case, as ladders himself would do. He always had ladders, and boy did he like a deal where someone would buy his ladders. And that might even mean that some of the other ladders that we find could be of his doing. Taking a careful look around, if we explore every single ladder that is among the Profane Capital, there's only one other ladder that at all resembles his style of ladders, as all the others here are pretty much made of metal, which means he couldn't have made them, as he simply just does more and more of them in this particular style with wood, which could imply perhaps he was an escapee. It could imply he was on the run, and in the process he ended up there in the Profane Capital. At the very least, that's what I think could be the case. That's how the letters really line up, to be sure. As this pretty much just comes straight from the jails themselves of Irithyll Dungeon. But something I wonder is where from Irithyll he could have possibly come from. All throughout Irithyll, there is only a singular ladder, and quite frankly, it bears no resemblance to his style at all, as it is metallic instead, implying it was more officially installed rather than some sort of troublemaker stowaway making it. And thus, we have no real sort of traces of a trail as to where he must have come from with it that is close by. It is also possible this could be something of the sort. But I'm curious as to the nature of those things protruding from the back like that. I have to double check the ladders about to see what else I can make of that sort of thing. But I double checked with the wiki as to where some of that stuff ended up providing you with in the Undead Settlement. It's really just junk items, and like the one that takes you up to the caster, the evangelists, is just a titanite shard that was on that corpse there, implying there was probably nothing too related to Gilligan there. And of course the other ladder just took you up onto a rooftop where a thrall was, and the way to the Mound Maker Covenant, which Gilligan wasn't quite a fighter, so I doubt that was too related to him either. Unless Holy Knight Hodrick let him go like he would have us. Just like, you don't belong here. Here, take this. But I'm not here to tell you that it's a lost cause to look into, because if we look carefully, we will in fact find more about his sort of left behind ladders of his unique style. Not only did he do them out of wood, but he would do them ridiculously long and extending quite far without any sort of backsteadying, and often would not miss a rung. In which case, we see here he had indeed kept up with his own sort of handiwork, and even more so in another location. And let me be clear as to where this location is. How, some way, throughout the painted world of Ariandel, we would continue finding these letters here, made of wood of incredible lengths, and not doing the extra sort of 45-degree sort of supports in the mix as a steadying method. As for why, it's an interesting question. For the case, we just keep finding his handiwork, both here and there, as there's an odd amount of wooden ladders just littered throughout this place, which could have just been done quite normally, as the Corvians were a rather usually civil people.
The sound of my...
But otherwise, it is most peculiar, as the more we keep looking around, the more we keep finding an odd assortment of wooden ladders that match more of Gilligan's style than any other ladder would happen to. To some extent, I can definitely agree to the idea of the concept that they were indeed put here by the Corvians to some degree. But at the same time, I can't help but shake the feeling with how interestingly placed they are, these letters I mean, that they were more so used for sneaking. And it's also curious as to why these Corvian knights have gone on a sort of rampage on their own kind. It could imply some sort of difference between them. It could imply something had happened amongst them, or it could imply they are suspicious of other individuals running amongst them. And it's quite curious as is to why there would be ladders going to their very own rooftops, of all things. As if someone just needed them in general to get around or to snoop around. And Gilligan himself was, as far as I was concerned, practically someone without a home. As to where he would have gone after Dark Souls 2, there really isn't a very evident answer as to where or why he would have gone, and for even how. But one thing is for certain, it's so much his handiwork that there is a specific letter that should stand out more than any other. In fact, it should stand out more than anything else here of this entire DLC as a odd choice of map creation. Should the player end up going this way, should they find and slay this specific tree, this specific tree, mind you, is that of Sullivan's mother. Should she be slain, this ladder appears of abnormal proportions. I'm with a little less failure. Let's go back to that ladder. On a side note, I did not know these things dropped alluring skulls. Let's not get destroyed by the profane flames on these things. As you can see, this ladder reaches of absurd proportions. And this kind of proportionality of a wooden ladder is next to unheard of throughout the Dark Souls series as a design, except in the processes of ladders delivered by that of Laddersmith Gilligan. And the fact that this goes down all the way to that of where Pontiff Sullivan himself resided is another interesting detail. I believe Gilligan was perhaps the means in which Sullivan was released from the painted world. And to further the credit of it, it could also play some part as to how Gilligan ended up as far as the Irithyll dungeon. It's like not only do those line up right there, but then it would have just gone up to here with his ladders once again. And he would have been explored with them further inward. It's hard to actually believe that he couldn't have had some kind of hand into it, as it is unlikely anyone else to have been making ladders of such unusual proportions, especially with the trees that belong here. As you can see, most trees don't actually compare that much similarly in length. It's like he somehow finds a way to do it, and I don't know if it's just like a weird thing he can do or what, but I recall in Dark Souls 2, he would pretty much just drop a sudden absurd length ladder down into a pit of whatever. It was just the most absurd thing ever. Even as far as here in the painted world, we would find a more proper designation of a properly crafted sort of ladder, as if it must have seen a different set of individuals making it, like that of Irithyll or elsewhere.
It will be a cold, dark, and very gentle place, and one day it will make someone a goodly home.
The awkward part is that I named this character Rubbish, by the way. A bit more out there speculation I have is that perhaps Gilligan himself was employed to these sort of services. Like, perhaps not only was he without a proper home and ended up here, but he found himself a proper sort of like duty in providing some of the residents here his own handiwork. And as the needs of them dwindled, he sort of stuck his nose into other places with him. And perhaps in that kind of curiosity, just brought him into more trouble, is my speculation. And I have another sort of idea about that, but we'll talk about that later. All this time, you were probably wondering, okay, when are we actually going to hear about anything about the Profane Flame? Well, Pontiff Sullivan used the Profane Flame when he came across it, and this is the world he had come from. As for what took over in him when he first saw that Profane Flame, we only have real speculation as to what it is. However, we have another sort of things to kind of take into consideration as to what it truly could have been. As there are some aspects that are underspoken of that could actually draw further conclusions as to what was really going on here at the painting, as to why he did what he did. Now, part of the painting's duties is when it becomes infested with rot, is that they burn their world away. And then essentially seek a means to go back over it and repair it. And so it's all good again. Only their original painter, Father Ariandel, was no longer fit to paint. And what once was actually originally pretty unscarred of an individual, Sister Elfrida, who he had made numerous paintings of, oddly enough without her scar, the one that took over on the right side of her face, on flames over and over again. And as we've met her, she has this burn mark scar, and would also kind of cover over it as if it was a thing of shame. Now, people speculated it was because she was ashen and failed to link the fire, and also failed to successfully usurp the flame. But I think it could be something else, actually. Now let's get to the real juicy details. You most certainly have seen them before, time and time again. An enemy with red eyes. Red eyes that glow. And their strength and habits are in turn much more aggressive and at times more beast-like than others. More feral, more absolutely raw. As someone even be more capable of taking you on with their own bare hands in the most furious manners imaginable. This is the start of what it is when those are corrupted by the abyss of the Profane Flame. But you all remember how Ariandel himself has this large sort of cauldron-like thing at him. But how good of a look did you actually look at it and put into consideration as to what it is and represents? Some of you probably looked at it and assumed perhaps it is simply a thing that is only to really do with collecting of his blood.
Return from whence
But
thou
as we know,
camest, for that is thy place of
okay, that's
belonging.
But as I was saying, the cauldron that too holds the Profane Flame itself is actually mighty similar in sort of size. It is quite an unusual thing in general to be kept, as it is created by unusual properties. Something we see with Ariandel, however, is that the flames he kind of creates emerge from, like, his cauldron, but like the blood of it. And I almost wonder if it could be in any way similar. It is suggested that for the painting needed for what is presumably his daughter, the new younger painter, that she needs blood of the dark soul for the pigment. What I almost wonder is if Ariandel himself was originally some amount of a bringer of such pigment with what blood he had, in which he himself would use it for his painting. I almost wonder if that could have any sort of correlations. But we don't really quite have any hard, conclusive evidence to that as an option. So for now I'm going to ignore it. By all means, there isn't a truly definite way to really say that they are in fact once consumed by the abyss. But the irregularity is enough to suggest there is quite something different about them compared to their counterparts. As these lycanthropes are in turn chained up and tried to keep into place and even secluded far from the others who would become hunters, ready to hunt what was possibly their fellow brethren. And in some cases, they just simply are a little bit different than others. One more noteworthy example are these soldiers of Lothric. How some bear red eyes and others do not. And I believe there is a certain reasoning for that. I think those that have been too close with Lothric, and even in the meeting of the Pontiff Sullivan, they would in turn see too much as to what becomes a force that consumes them in a more mindless sort of servitude, and also what is their darker side of themselves, as they were once prominent figures that represented a more holier standing, as is implied with their weapons and armor. But just how holy were they exactly? Well, the thing is, they even used to have some amount of pledge to that of the Nameless King, as it is actually an amount of a bit of like a drop we can even get from them to get sunlight medal, the metals of sunlight that are used to make sort of offerings to that of the Nameless King's statues that are broken and crumbled throughout ever that we know of. As one even resides here in the Lothric Castle. An interesting detail of that of its own, to be honest, and probably one overlooked in meaning. But it has further meanings, but that gets a little further away from this topic at hand. As a side note to mention, to the topic of Lothric Castle and Corruptions of the Abyss, here in the Ring City DLC, we find a sort of Lothric Castle banner that belongs to that of their knights here in the Ring City at what is more than likely a sort of kind of hidden area in regards to what is the practices of the light still, and that's towards the bonfire and Gwyn's methods, if I were to guess. As we also find their sort of carpeting design here. We find the same exact pew style, the same exact sort of ceremonial stand, sword, banner, crest, and even some of their statues, as the Way of Lights had even a serpent of the world on its side. These are all things quite representative of Lothric in some degree. And it's actually quite fitting that this sort of hidden area, as shared with us by Shira, would tell us to go here to go face Midir. And in turn, in defeating Midir, earns us the Covenant Enlightenment as a spear of the Church of Filianor, which means we are indeed in servitude of the gods in this place. And this duty was one of such. But whether or not it was in case Midir forgot who he was, or if it was just of disdain that he was in fact a dragon, we cannot truly know for certain. But whether or not this is proof that Lothric itself was able to normally suppress what was amount of dark is also up for debate, but it is a most curious feature nonetheless. How do you suppose the crest of this attire once looked? Certainly interesting to me. Mostly because I've been staring at crests a lot lately in these games. In the days of old, the Abyss was considered unstoppable, as it is even expressed to the watchdogs of Faerun that they should simply expect to drop their means of defense, as it is unstoppable. No simple shield is going to be the real deal to protect them from it. And yet it's also a bit symbolic of the one who was great in falling to the Abyss as well, of Artorias, the Abyss Watcher, who sacrificed his shield and his own left arm to protect his companion. And in turn, he was covered in material wrought by the Abyss. He was corrupted by the Abyss, and would emit a more dark of aura and erratic sort of actions than any other opponent you've ever faced. Something too to note about the Abyss Watchers themselves, who would follow in that wolf's footsteps, is that in their own attire they too would see some amount of abyss-like material draped upon it. And some of the Abyss Watchers themselves we would witness playing a sort of team-like combat, as some would be with red eyes and some were without them. And the ones with red eyes would be the only ones able to inflict any amount of harm upon those without them. And so we see there is some kind of us versus them amongst them. An interesting detail to note for certain. And so, because the Abyss Watchers will act without hesitation, any sort of sign of the Abyss and any kind of presence and any amount of measure in order to intervene and stop it, it's actually pretty safe to assume the ones with the red eyes were those being taken by the Abyss. If we are to take that as some kind of rule, though, it would actually make a certain amount of other assumptions as to how it's actually traveled and by whom. One thing we do know for certain is that Pontiff Sullivan himself kind of spread it once he's seen it. He spread it from the profane capital, brought it to Irithyll, and even to some amount in Orlando. As before Dark Souls 3 even, there was almost never such a thing as a red-eyed opponent. Which is very peculiar, especially if you recall in Orlando. There was no such thing as a red-eyed Silver Knight, but certainly enough here in Dark Souls 3, there are some. And not only are their eyes red, but we would see Aldrich of the Deep had infiltrated in Orlando and made quite a mess of the throne room, as he had entrapped a god with him with the help of the pontiff. And as we have gotten to him, the whole hallways up to the princess's chamber are all sludged, damp, destroyed, infested with grubs. And we find him consuming one of the last of the deities here in Orlando. We find him consuming Gwendolyn. And we also find these faithful Aldrich here. Aldrich's own faithful of deacons in this location. And as you can see, they too have the same eyes. Which means pretty much all the deacons, any questioners of bizarre fates and faith, they were all made in this kind of twist of themselves. And in turn, they all would also spread the profane flame themselves in caste. And be hyper aggressive as well. Irithyll, and even the profane capital, where there is moisture, there are these centipede women. Women so twisted from their original form, they no longer bear any sort of regular face. And what was of their original body became many more limbs and much more vile than was before. As they become immune to toxic and poison. And even emit it. And rather than their head being the main part of their consumptionary habits, it is now their torso instead. Also here in Irithyll, we had the watchdogs that belonged to the Pontiff Sullivan. One guarded this bridge, and if not slain, he would simply jump down below should we try traversing about down there. And then 2 others would exist guarding one of the most head of the deacons that was most faithful to that of Aldrich. So faithful, he would mimic his gluttonous behaviors and sort of be brought down in secret. As to how he passed, we cannot be quite too sure. But he is safeguarded by 2 of the pets belonging to the Pontiff Sullivan. And that could also imply either some amount of secrecy of the Pontiff in general, or some amount of security to one so dedicated to Aldrich. And if it is the case of Aldrich, it could also imply another sort of factor as to how these beasts are made, but it is kind of implied that there is some amount of possible influence of Aldrich in there, as Aldrich's possible mother is Rosaria of all, as he is also considered possibly one who truly belongs at Anne Orlando of all locations, as it was suggested, his true home, which could imply his passed on sort of nature from Rosaria, who was in fact a deity and sort of entity in representation to that of rebirth, that perhaps he too had some kind of hand at such a thing. And interestingly enough, we find one of his man grubs down there passed away of mysterious causes. And if the fact of rebirth is true enough, that perhaps he too could perform it. I also wondered if that could be part of what happened to some extent in Lothric Castle to Gertrude, or even that of the pilgrim butterflies, or if that could be part of Sullivan's duty, as it was implied that to some amount of punishments, those who worship the angels were punished by unspeakable means. And that really just opens us to our own imagination on such a regard. But it's pretty well speculated that I could imply experimentations, as there is this particular pile of feathers in Prince Lothric's own room. And quite frankly, we know the pilgrims themselves become angels otherwise. But the pilgrim butterflies also have some slight mimicry to that of the branches, that is, of a tree. And not only that, of some similarity to the sort of branch-like wings spread by the Pontiff Sullivan in his own boss fight. So it is a little bit more food for thought in that regard as to the correlations of such a thing. And it does also add up to a sort of amount of sense, but there's more than likely more details than simply that to it. But piecing together as to what exactly happened isn't too difficult when it comes to this topic. As for how or when it happened, that is the more interesting one to try to piece together. And I really do think this guy has some part of what we would need to kind of piece that kind of order of operations together. In terms of how it spread after the Profane Flame itself had emerged. It is more than likely he was, to an extent, there as well with the residents of the Corvians at the Painted World. What's interestingly enough is that the Corvians that used to spread the tales of stories and such to kind of motivate people in the paths of the forewarned to go to the painting, they are the ones that we would see at places like the Road of Sacrifices, where they spread their wings just sort of in a weird emerged kind of fashion. And like the one we would see at the beginning of the Painted World, tell us to find a nice rot pile for ourselves. But the more iconic of them are the ones that sort of transform with feathers, and the storytellers that spit poison gases at us from their staff and get the other ones to enrage. To me, that's an interesting thing, that not only are they considered Corvians, but they would also be more human-like faced than other Corvians, like that of I forget what his name was in like Dark Souls 2, but he was a smith and he would help make boss weapons. And then there was like the Corvians of Dark Souls 1, which were just straight up birdmen that would like jump at you, peck at you. And they were just some outright disturbed sort of creatures. Then there's the ones here in Dark Souls 3, where they have a Corvian settlement also. And there's the Corvian Knights, that are more similar to the Dark Souls 1 Corvians. So that does also add another layer to the topic. Why is there a secondary set of Corvians? Could it be of some amount of effect of the Profane Flame as well? And I want to say yes and no. The reason why I have to express why it is both yes and no is that some have red. There is one or two that has red eyes, and the rest simply do not. Which is an interesting enough sort of detail. And we don't really have any proper explanation as to why it's the case. But across this bridge yonder, there is a singular Corvian that spared red eyes. Whether or not I probably just killed it or not, I have to double check, but I think it was probably actually one that was through this little detoured route. In which case, if that is true, it could imply they were actually a little more distant from that of the other Corvians here. First, I have to get angry at these dogs for being dogs in Dark Souls games. Because let's be honest, that is a crime against God right there. As we see here, this specific Corvian bears red eyes. To me, that's a very peculiar detail. And he's also incredibly distant from the other ones. So it really does add to the question, why? And what is the real difference between them and the other Corvians of the settlement? And I almost wonder if it's part of their own transposing sort of magic to be able to handle like souls into boss weapons like in Dark Souls 2. To be able to shift their form also. Or even if it was like some amount of nature as to where they had originally come from. That perhaps it could be in some relativity to that of Corland, like that little lord of ours at the Firelink Shrine. Whichever the case, there aren't too many very well-spoken details to make sense of for such a thing. One thing we do know of these Corvians, though, is that they are lined up along the road of sacrifices, which gets its name as those being brought from the undead settlement to be taken to Aldrich's Cathedral of the Deep to be sacrificed often traverse this way, as perhaps convinced by the cathedral's missionaries, the evangelists. And I think what it probably takes to convince them is some amount of the lack of belonging, the lack of wanting. But these Corvians themselves, as explained on their staff here, the storyteller staff, we understand that they are here to kind of tell people of a place that is for the forlorn, a painted world, where those who no longer have a true home can make into their home. In which case, we know why these Corvians are truly here. We just don't quite understand the nature as to why they are different. And then we know that one that was up there was physically different as well, as he had more health than them, and he was also physically more dangerous as well. So there is a bit of food for thought right there. So I did in fact make a sort of connection about what could be the state of difference between these Corvians and the other ones. And I've come to realize that the storytellers of these ones can drop a hollow gem stone. Now, to me, that's a very interesting detail, because that could imply some sort of states that they themselves represent and such. And I almost wonder if that means that these ones were too, like, hollowing as well. Alternative suspicion I have lies with what we can recall from Dark Souls 2. In Dark Souls 2, we do meet a Corvian that was of the original nature, and they would talk to us, and they would also kind of point out that we humans are very curious, and also get so curious and concerned of things beyond our own nature, as we see basically a talking bird man before us, and they would kind of poke fun of this. So I almost wonder if it could be part of that, to like overcome that as a nature of their themselves to us as they try to bring in the Forlorn. But in general, that would make an amount of sense, as we literally see that the painted world that was home of the Forlorn that they serve and sell to others is guided by one who kind of has origins with that of Londor, of the Dark, and their sort of ideals. And in turn, they would even sort of copy that of her arts to some extent, to some amount of success. Also, I apologize if it seems like I'm just going over needless details, but I keep bringing up all these kinds of details to people, and they just kind of blow it off like, oh no, it's because they're stronger or something. And I'm just thinking, that doesn't make any sense, especially in the case of the Abyss Watchers. Why would that make any sense? But, there is another sort of interesting detail about this red-eyed entities that is of the world. And that really does correlate to where all we find it. These red-eyed entities. Now, of course, there's that Corvian there. And there has been a few sort of undead there at the settlement. And of course we've seen those of the knights at the Lothar Castle. Down this way, we've seen the Lycanthropes. After that, we see nothing of the sort in the Farron Swamp at all, which is an interesting enough detail and could imply that that much of the Abyss is actually put on hold, as it's pretty much Farron territory, the Abyss Watchers territory, their watch, their rule, their guard. It implies they have seen actual success in their methods, even if it does become heretical. Throughout the entirety of the Cathedral of the Deep, there is only one entity of this entire place that had any sort of red eyes, and that is none other than the deacons here, as if they were the only ones that needed any sort of convincing. At the Catacombs of Carthus, only one type of entity here tends to have any red eyes at all, and that is these higher up sort of skeletons, the Carthus Grave Wardens, as they are called, who were in practice of any sort of means necessary to win. Even the most frowned upon methods of practice is considered honor in their book, as what honor is there in losing to what could have been defeated by some kind of silly trick or dirty, underhanded trick. Then, as part of the proof that Wolnir himself was not quite consumed by the Abyss, he was with regular sort of empty eye sockets. No sort of extra spiritness inside of them that would depict that he would, like, revive or something. And he was protected from the Abyss below him, as he wore the gold bracelets of clerics to kind of better repel the effects of the Abyss, as he would hide within it as his sort of go-to way to kind of outlast all other lords that all exist. And so he would be the last one standing in the end. as that is the interests of the Way of Karthus, and more than likely, judging by the place of Farron Keep being literally on top of the Karthus catacombs, also what got the Abyss Watchers involved, as they had buried Karthus below themselves, and then they became Lords of Cinder, and in that process, as time passed, grew and a swamp over what was once Karthus, as now a very swamp-infested Farron Keep. But here in Irithyll Dungeon, only one entity exists that at all bears any sort of resemblance of corruption, that is of the Abyss. Don't be a chair. You became a chair. Oh yes, the sneaky, stealthy chair. It's gotta be a floor thing, right? So it's like 50-50. There it is. The singular entity that exists is none other than over there. A singular Lycanthrope. They're most definitely not on the same side. As they bear no gripes to go up against each other in any way, shape, or form. Which could actually prove as a better sort of evidence that the jailers themselves aren't quite corrupted by the Abyss, to be honest. So if you ever wanted a little more substance to make heads and tails of, that is an interesting factor, especially that a Lycanthrope would be all the way from the Road of Sacrifices, all the way from the Crucifixion Woods, to here in an Irithyll dungeon where there's no evident pathways between the two besides the Karthus catacombs. However, we do realize there is some sort of collapsed path between Irithyll and somewhere else, as there is a sort of at the front of Irithyll, the very bridge, there is a sort of like a landslide or something being just absolutely destroyed, but we don't actually know where it would have led to otherwise. As we try to conclude a proper path between the Road of Sacrifices and leading to that of Irithyll, it really does create more questions than answers at first as to how they would have truly properly traveled to Irithyll from there, until you realize that amount of this place is actually quite sectioned off very curiously. As in, it looks like a normal sort of transitioning area, and then it's just another kind of wall kind of built around it all, as if to contain it. And I think that was part of the Abyss Watcher's initial means to kind of secure this place. And in turn, there probably would have been Another kind of pathway we could take, probably pretty close by. Although in general, trying to navigate this place as to how on earth it would have gone directly to Irithyll makes little to no sense otherwise. But it's also quite possible to some extent the Catacombs of Karthus was actually part of some of the means to make the trip, as the Abyss Watchers probably constructed some amount of the passageway to secure Karthus in their care, and also an amount of Anor Londo to as well, to have some amount of watchful eye through the means of Irithyll. Whether or not that is true, there really isn't any way for us to know. And otherwise, any further sort of logical means to sort of draw us a path between us to Irithyll just doesn't really quite add up in any way, shape, or form. Unless if like another pathway was perhaps massively closed off back at the undead settlement and was drastically shifted. But if you like look carefully from one location to another at the undead settlement, like most other means are just drastically that much higher from any logical pathway that would take you to Irithyll if you look from as high as the Giant's Tower. And so that's most of the curious nature as to what seems to be our understanding as to how the Profane Flame was moved about, and as well as a singular Lycanthrope from these sort of parts all the way to Irithyll, and why that's particularly strange. However, let's talk about where the Red Eyes Corruptions of the Abyss is certainly not at. Now, if we look at our little travel list, there's actual like sectionings we can say it's clearly not here, just outright. Now, for the most part, the Cemetery of Ash is a definite yes. Now, there are some exceptions to that as a factor. Gundyr. Gundyr does get the Red Eyes effect in him. And in our sort of Eudex Gundyr, we also see him do the little puss of a man thing. Which I wonder if that is necessarily that of the Abyss, or an enhanced variation of transformation brought by Lothric's desires to try to bring that of dragons and control to dragons. And I want to say it's probably a little bit of both, as Lothric tried a little of incorporation of everyone and everything in its castle and practices to that of its defense, and it's really an interesting topic of its own. But moving on. Of course, there is that whole section of the Farron Keep. Let's see. Which has massive depictions of its own that perhaps it really is a thing that was a thing of the Abyss, as those not of the Abyss and watchguarding against it do not share this red-eyed nature, and even the Gru themselves will fight servants of Londor, the dark race. But the Demon Ruins, virtually nowhere in the Demon Ruins is that also a thing, except for the two Karthus skeleton grave wardens nearby the three-piece ballista that faces onward against the demons. And likewise, the demons are against the Carthans and their skeletons, but the demons are also on very good terms with the Gru, which could imply that the Gru are, in fact, entities against the things correlated to the Abyss, and also that they are in a cooperative nature against the Carthans, and that also could depict some kind of bad history of Carthus in general. It's hard to say too much further about the Profane Capital, as I guess what damage is done is truly done. But we do see Yorm the Giant himself have red eyes in the end, but originally they didn't show him with it, which means he eventually succumbed to the corruptions of the Profane Flame himself after his awakening. And literally nowhere in Archdragon Peak is there red eyes at all. Nor is there red eyes of most Souls of Cinders, other than that of the Abyss Watchers that we can presume are corrupted. And then nowhere at all in the Ring City DLC is there any red eyes of the least. Now let's talk about where this Profane Flame truly came from. Like, long term came from. And there are some reasonable theories we can kind of make suggestions off of. But we can easily debunk one of those theories pretty right away. This weapon here, the Eleonora, is a very curious natured weapon indeed. And it's found here in the Profane Capital itself. But what is it exactly? A strange weapon found among the malformed inhabitants of the Profane Capital. The Profane Flame was triggered by the curse of these women, relatives of a certain oracle, but despite their culpability, they went on living without any cares. And the effects of this weapon is called Feast Bell. Hold up axe and wave to emit a solemn chime to temporarily make weapons lacerating, and to restore HP for each hit. I had a number of suspicions about that in general, but it's like just a tip of this thing. It's like it reminds me of some place, but honestly I can't put my finger on it. Looking around the Profane Capital in general, I'm not really seeing any reasonable roofing architecture to give me further insight of an opinion. My first instinct of this was perhaps it had to do with those of Londor. In fact, my first opinion was that it perhaps was named after the third sister of the Sable Church. However, I actually debunked that idea. As if we read the description of this, we already know the name of the third sister, Lilian. But that also implies there was a mother, kind of, or parent. As for who this parent is, there isn't quite a proper way to tell. But the fact that the sisters were interested in usurping the fire, it's like we can kind of make suspicions, but we otherwise truly don't know. It could be possible that this weapon belonged to such a person, but there's really nothing to really tell us that is indeed the case. However, we do know the Sable Church was in ties with Koth himself. So off that, we can make that kind of suspicion, but it is not the three sisters of the Sable Church who had indeed brought it upon the profane capital. So, we can trust there was someone who wielded this. As for whom or why, we can't truly know. But we do actually know it does a sort of miracle-like effect that influences laceration. However, we know all three sisters of the Sable Church are all masters of sword, which means this couldn't have been the weapon of the third sister. Although, it could be that it still could have been. An interesting detail we hear at the Ring City is that there was a person who took comfort in the Abyss even after slewing their own kin. It has a number of depictions as to who it could be. Now, someone might speculate that could mean like, perhaps Seath the Scaleless, but it talked about the sunless sky. Like, nothing else could possibly compare with where they were at with the Abyss, in turn as a comfort. And something I wondered is if that could imply at all, like, Yuria. Like, maybe the reason we never find a third sister is that perhaps Yuria slew her. That is one way to kind of interpret that. And it is certainly an interesting question to take into consideration. But what's interesting about the weapon of Eleonora is that it implies the person who had done this sort of curse upon the thing. They unleashed their curse and then continued on as if continued on living without care. The weapon itself implies it was just sort of found amongst these inhabitants here. Now, something to note about bleeding weapons. It is implied in the Grave Wardens that run that of the Cathedral of the Deep is that their weapons inflict bleed to help keep those who keep rising dead longer, keep them from rising from their graves sooner, which is certainly an interesting note. And I almost wonder if it could have some amount of similar sort of inspiration of what had truly happened. But these other theories, the Profane Flame is in a large sort of crucible. In Dark Souls 2, we find another sort of fire in the sort of crucible in the dark chasms of old. I wondered if it could be of that sort of nature, and it could be depicting a tale of us achieving it and defeating a dark lurker and continuing onward to our linking of the fire and seeking the throne. I do wonder if it could mean something like that. And so that is our second sort of theory. And then the third theory is that it's actually of relations to Oolacile, as those of Oolacile, the Xanthus, are some of our first noteworthy instances of enemy pyromancies. As we see one, the King Jeremiah or something like that, in the Painted World of Ariamis. We see the Xanthus pyromancies in Dark Chasm of Old. And noteworthy, we find that we get the Xanthus set at our tier 3 reward with the Pilgrims of the Dark Covenant in Dark Souls 2. Which obviously depicts that the Xanthus are indeed close with the Dark. And of course, their oracle of choice would be that of Koth, the supposed two-faced serpent to some. The oracle in 2, if it is of us, would be that dark diver fellow. Or perhaps it could even be that of Agdane, to some degree. Whichever the case, we really can't make too many assumptions, as there are many prominent figures who could count as an almost oracle there in Dark Souls 2, like Strayed, who was considered so wise. They were fearful of him, of his wisdom, and he was also in some prominence with the dark, and the dark arts, and even soul transposition. But that dark diver, we gave him humanity, and he would pretty much awaken the means for us to dive deep within the dark, and lighting these flames for some reason ascended us in our quest of dark. So it is certainly an amount of topics to take into consideration. And honestly, I think it's a pretty fun topic. What I otherwise believe could very well be depicting some amount of what is the carefree nature of the Xanthus. The Xanthus were all around considered foolish. In fact, the more you look into them, the more you catch any sort of wind of details on them and their actions, the more you realize these were actually all around foolish individuals by no matter whom they were interacted with, no matter whom talks of them. They were foolish for their attire, they were foolish for how they glowed, they were foolish for Hazel's ideals of companionship. they were foolish to more than likely be the cause of Manus. And you know what? They were probably foolish enough to think they could suppress the dark with the thickness of their fabrics covering and wrapped around their head, that their heads wouldn't explode. They were probably daring fools, but also talented fools. And I think that's probably a pretty fair assessment of them. And that's, they would actually be a pretty fair match about it. However, the weapon would imply otherwise. That since it's a weapon of bleed, and more miracle-based rather than, magic-based, there's no way it could have possibly been Xanthus. And judging by the location as to where we find that weapon at, it makes more sense to me that it would have been something more Dark Souls 2 age and onward. Or perhaps even just, passed down from that of the Sabled Church. Although we don't actually truly find Londor in this game. So it doesn't make sense to me that it would be too much of that kind of case scenario. So the more logical scenario would have been that we unleashed it. But anyhow, let's discuss some of the design layouts that is of the Profane Capital here. Now, obviously this archway is collapsed. As to what has done it, there really isn't too good of a way for us to know this. We see the bridge upon it is also pretty badly damaged up. See a series of towers. These towers once belonged to. It's really up to our imagination and what we think we recognize out of them. But that's not much for us to go off of neither. Further down, it's just endless below, or so it seems. But also still kind of bridges about and finds structures to fill its own gaps. Tiled floors that have seen various wreckage and dismay take place. As one thing got shoved out of place, another thing got shoved out of place. This once was a road that led to somewhere. As to where or how, there really isn't too good of a clue. Or at least not here. But it's possible that it's led up more naturally to places such as Irithyll and that. In which case it could mean more to the idea that it once was a place that actually thrived and led to here and there. It led some amounts of sincere contribution before it was fully condemned, and as to how it was fully condemned, that too is up to our imagination, as it's literally not mentioned how it was. But we realize that it was recognized as the Profane Capital, home of the Profane Flame. A flame that consumes the hearts of men, turns them to beasts, and really brings out the worst in people. A thing that could not be stopped and would crush the weight of the people with it. At the very least, that's what I would assume something such as this as a design could mean. What's interesting to me about this is how mostly symmetrical it is from this side, which could mean it's supposed to be viewed from this angle for some reason. At least that's an impression I've gotten. And the interesting thing is, it wasn't moved to some kind of location that would conceal it. It wasn't moved to some sort of location that would condemn it further. It wasn't given some sort of basic carry of a position. Instead, it was kept upon this sort of setup here. Of fine craftsmanship, perhaps? Or at least that's what we can at first assume. But it's like, why would someone put so much investment in all this detail of people and bearing of it? As they were even at great threat of being taken by the flame itself. And who would even pedestal it here, directly in the center, where all attention can gander and pass through, and even before and directly down from where Yulm himself was seated? Could it be that it was a thing done in spite? Could it be that someone actually wanted to share the flame? Or could it even be, and this is going to be the most interesting theory, that these people here, statued here, they were actually the people who are carrying it, trying to relocate it. And they could never quite make the full trip. And why do I say that? Well, in Dark Souls 2, we actually seen petrification. We've literally seen 5 figures that became petrified into their positions. We've seen a Cyclops, we've seen the Lion Mane soldiers, we even seen a sort of pyromancer, a young, thriving pyromancer miss. As to the nature as to why they were at all sort of petrified into like a statue, I'm not actually too sure. I might actually look that up real quick. In fact, let me do that real quick before I say anything else. Alrighty. So I double checked. There isn't quite any verification as to what has induced such a petrification. And so we can actually make a fun amount of assumptions off of this. And lo and behold, there is actually more fun assumptions we can indeed make off of this topic. In fact, if I didn't think about it sooner, I probably wouldn't have ever thought of the idea that maybe the Profane Flame and ideals of the curse related around it could be in some way tied about it. And in fact, that would also explain another thing. So, one thing we were never clarified on is how demons might possibly age. And as they age, what are the real effects of that? Now, we see that what's considered the oldest demon to exist, the Demon King here, that was at the Demon Ruins, or I should say, just the area outside of the Demon Ruins, that he was considered the oldest demon to be alive to see what had befallen to his previous homeland, and that. But besides that, we see another demon in this place, one that's not considered as old, but interestingly enough, this other demon we see has lost their flame. Now, there's a funny thing about demons and their flames. Let's see. To better explain this, let's take a look at an item description so you know I'm not just making this up. Last flame lit by the demon princes, this pyromancy hurls a clump of chaos. Upon impact, the clump of chaos seethes wildly, condenses briefly, then explodes violently. To the demons, these clumps are shreds of life. Which means any amount of chaos, any amount of surviving and thriving flame is considered life. So, yeah, the fact that there is in fact a demon in this game that is completely without its fire, its true fire, and as it walks and sort of guards along the way to the Lothric castles with its collapsed bridge location, that could actually leave us some implications as to what could actually be in story relativity. Now, something else I thought was very interesting is how very extra stone-like the gargoyles are of this game. In fact, you could look at these gargoyles and mistaken them for being exactly the same. Now, I believe the change is that the gargoyles too are affected by the Profane Flame. Things not quite human that survived more with flame essence to themselves already. Instead of simply being corrupted, they would instead lose the flame essence of themselves, as it was perhaps a mixed match from that of the Profane Flames. At least that's kind of the idea I'm getting. And if you pay attention also to other circumstances, I don't know if I have this one. Yes, I do. You'll notice compared to, let's see, compared to what is a chaos skill, the uses are very different in requirement. Like, say this one, 0 attribute requirements, 0 attribute requirements. This one, it requires a matching of both sides, but I can understand it's probably a bit more advanced than just a simple instinctual thing. But it still requires faith in this regard, which probably hints a bit of a difference in pyromancies to ones that are more specially coordinated as a plain spell practice. And the fact that this one is pure sorcery related of intelligence, we can actually make guesses on that to what is considered dark arts in general. As this is called the Profane Flame, and this too would mention of the Profane Flame's nature with that of the capital here. So this does also kind of further the idea that of the concept that it is a pure more different kind of matchup topic than that of mere flames of chaos, at the very least, and more as like a sorcery in comparison. And not only that, the Profane Flame itself gets more defined as being everlasting because it's created by sorcery, which could further the idea that it was provided by some kind of more hex kind of effect in the Dark Souls 2 age, especially if we acknowledge the location as to where we're getting this from, which has been so far mainly only in correlations to things of Dark Souls 2, to be honest. And I actually have a sort of thought about the centipede women. One sort of little extra thought I had about them is, are they truly women that were simply turned into centipedes? Or could they even have been like those weird like murky creatures of the Shrine of Amana that slink out and come after you or something? But then I was thinking, do those even have hair? To be honest, I don't actually remember that part. So I'm not really going to link that together in any way, shape, or form. It was just a little extra thought, just like, could those be related? And honestly, I'm not convinced just yet. But something we can know and understand about this sort of layout here, though, is actually this floor. This floor is used, this particular design, I should explain, is more commonly used in sort of holier practiced grounds of humans. Places like the Cathedral of the Deep, places like the sort of more sacred area of that of the Ring City that hides the sort of secret covenant like area where Shira instructs us to take to get to Midir. Like, it's present there too, but it's in a different kind of size, if I recall correctly. Or at the very least, Shira herself's room where she was locked up with the Mad King on like a spear has that floor pattern designed to it. I do actually have the spear on this character. I went through quite a bit of trouble for a faith build, and I must say, it's been an interesting run. But there's a little bit of extra insight for you. We do find this elsewhere, but my mind's drawing a bit of a blank at the moment. I think we also see this actually in Dark Souls 2, to be honest, We see this at the Hades Tower. Like, dead center of it. Where we fight the Dragon Knight. Or Dragon Rider. Yeah, there's a bit of like a thought to that one. The only difference is we don't have a square floor there. We just have the circle part. So there's a little bit more on that. Whether or not we should be recognizing any sort of similarities in this lighting design, I'm not quite sure just yet. I'd have to like do some like backtracking of design and from one place to another, and that'd be like cross game wise. At the moment I really don't have like Dark Souls 2 installed, and I don't want to like go through the trouble of that right now. But I've been watching a couple people's like playthrough stuff about it, which has been actually most entertaining. It's actually an interesting thing to notice, is that they have like a glowy whitish bluish eyes, and I almost wonder if that could mean something else entirely. Like, I've been associating the red ones to be perhaps taken by the Profane Flame. I don't know what that would mean though for this other color. Let's see. Nothing too interesting in the design of their robes, like the patterns I was looking at. Nothing like crests or anything of that nature, so there's nothing there to make any sort of hard conclusions. But I might do further digging and inspecting on that one at some point. But besides the he got into something he shouldn't have idea as to what had befallen to our good buddy here, another idea I had was maybe he got sort of like employed to help kind of like find something that would sort of like change the tides as to what kind of happened with Painted World. Something I'm trying to understand though is if this is like a rotting body, or is if he's turned to stone here. Is something I'm actually not too certain. Like, it's possible that could have been like maybe he was even like helping out Sullivan looking for a sort of worthy, useful fire, and perhaps they stumbled on this, and maybe in some way it's turned him to stone, perhaps. I'm honestly not too certain. Part of why I'm uncertain is it's rare for us to find distinguishable bodies in these games, and not only is it rare to find distinguishable bodies, it's rare to find distinguishable bodies that look semi-stone-like. So it really is more of like a guess of an idea to the topic, but it certainly adds more fuel of interest and ideas. Otherwise, I still like to think there's more yet to be quite observed. But Another sort of idea someone had about the stonification that was in Dark Souls 2 was that the branches of yore were perhaps of the fragrant branches of yore. It was suggested by someone that they could be parts of the Bed of Chaos, as the Bed of Chaos was a thing to do with that of life. It could even be a case where the branches themselves were just of one of the more ethereal trees, like one of the ones that the Millwoods Knights were hard dedicated to. But it was certainly an interesting idea to me that would be what it would take to sort of bring back life to someone of this sort. And it almost makes me wonder if there was supposed to be something close to that nature here in Dark Souls 3 that just never really became a thing. Like, instead of finding anything of that nature, we have these young white branches. And these, when you inspect them, it implies dusk, that they came from trees sprouted from saplings brought by her first staffer or something. And it's like, that's interesting. And that also tells us about why certain giants with a very good eye and shot might be guarding them. But at the same time, it doesn't fully explain everything to us. But it is certainly an interesting topic to explore on, in my opinion. But the very last sort of mention I want to get about the topic, because I know other people have been curious as to what this is about, and I do have a suspicion about that. But the suspicion is that it is most definitely in relation to Pontiff Sullivan, as he is an entity that is like part man, part tree. But whether or not it was related to the Profane Flame, I am not so convinced. But it is more than likely of somewhat relativity of that, and more so a fate of those more dear to those who are of the lower class of Lothric Castle, of the knights and general soldiers, and in turn others would be seen sort of praying at them, lost in their sort of mourning. You probably wondered if they were worshipping them. I like to think it's more likely preying upon them. They were more likely of a series of the unfortunate class of Lothric Castle, unfit for proper knighthood, and the strength of their knights to wield their mightiest weapons and armor. And yet we see a singular pus of the men amongst them. Now, I think that singular pus of a man sort of escaped what was where the other pus of men sort of developed, which more than likely would have been at the very area we see the garden to Osiris. I think if they're considered innate in nature, or perhaps they just aren't ready or able to ascend that kind of state of being where they sprout that sort of pus that is like that of the serpent men, as a literal serpent-like head emerges from its which we can half assume is probably sampled from the what was of the Serpentmen beyond Osiris, that was probably used upon them in some way or shape or form, and could even very well be part of the toxic ground of that garden, as perhaps part of like their feeding or fermenting in the process. In turn, he would have, if he was innate of any such properties, to some extent they were probably allowed to just simply walk away, as they were probably considered lower than even that of certain other standpoints, in which they would come upon stuff such as this with their fellow hollows of Lothric, and would mourn. But seeing us and having that change within them, they knew a threat amongst us, amongst themselves, and they chose their alternative form as their instincts would kick in. So if you're ever wondering about that, that's more than likely exactly what happened. And I assume those pus of men are actually part of the means as to how Lothric had acquired the ability to get sort of drakes in their servitude. These sort of wyverns. More than likely they were formerly pus of men themselves, and as we find the two that station themselves, they emit the pus of men emission of their form from their feet, which you would notice up close. But that's mostly off topic of the rest of the video. But yeah, I just thought I'd give you that little bit of a teaser as to the kind of things I've been kind of inspecting of the game and getting very half-decent sorts of answers for. But thank you very much if you've watched for this long, and maybe even enjoyed some of the things I've come across. But you have yourselves a hot diggity good day, and have a good one. Bye bye.